Hi, I'm Angie Hicks, co-founder of Angie. One thing I've learned is that you buy a house, but you make it a home. And for decades, Angie's helped millions of homeowners hire skilled pros for the projects that matter. Get all your jobs done well at Angie.com.
All right, hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this whole episode of the podcast, it's well, you know, folks, it's actually just me, all alone, forever alone. You remember that meme? Back in the good old days, I'm sure you do. So it's a Mike solo today, so I guess I'll just talk to you instead of nobody else. How you doing?
How you doing? I'm doing fine. I just got here today.
Great, or that sucks. Whichever is appropriate. Good, I hope. So let's just get into it. Well, this is a bit of a long one, so let's stop kicking the tires, stop your grinning, drop your linen, and let's give this whole story a go. So, to begin, we got a scene to set, and it all starts with the Homestead Act of 1862, one of the most important pieces of legislation in all of American history. The act was signed into law by Abraham Lincoln on May 20th, 1862, but it didn't actually go into effect until January 1st of the following year. This law allowed for anyone aged 21 and up, or the head of a household, to claim 160 acres of land in exchange for a filing fee. The land could be claimed by anyone at all, absolutely anyone, and it was designed to help and encourage folk to start settling the West, settling the frontier. Well, I mean, of course, except the indigenous Native Americans who already lived throughout the land in question and had, been living there for quite a long time. The mass genocide and displacement of the indigenous populations of America that's another episode. That's a whole other, so let's stick with this. Today, though, we're looking at one particular family who, much like millions of others before and after them, saw the potential advantages in setting up home in the midst of the American frontier. The story of the Bender family, or the Bloody Benders as they are better known, is as much a classic piece of American history as it is American folklore. How many people the Benders killed is very much a matter of speculation, but the best informed estimates put it anywhere between a dozen and as many as 20 or more. Either way, they landed pretty high up there when it comes to serial killers, family killers on the frontier. In fact, they're probably the most famous one. The Bender family antics went undetected for what they were actually doing. Nobody really knew it for quite some time. See, in the second half of the 19th century, the West was still very much wild. If the land didn't kill you, there were plenty of renegade immigrants and pissed off American natives to mop up the rest of you. The few who slid through the violent colander of life on the frontier were the hardest of the lucky few. People disappearing wasn't anything unusual. Sometimes they turned up, dead or alive, and frankly folks, guess what? Sometimes they didn't at all. Traveling across the North American continent was very much, an at-your-own-risk kind of dealio. In the census of 1870, there were 37 states making up the US at the time. The latest additions being West Virginia, Nebraska, Nevada, and of course, our setting for today, Kansas. Kansas officially became a state in 1861, so it first appeared in the 1870 census. Now, the entire settled population of the US at the time was counted as around 200,000 people shy of 40 million residents. Now, of course, there's a huge asterisk right next to that number because it didn't account for the indigenous population who hadn't been pushed off their land yet, killed, and or forced to settle in newly built townships, villages, and cities. So the 40 million number that we know of, that we can say for sure who lived in America at the time, it's basically the equivalent of the modern day population of California, being scattered across the entire country. Canada had also gained its independence from Great Britain around, the same time, becoming its own country just 3 years earlier on what was called Dominion Day, or July 1st of 1867 to the rest of us. The Benders story in the United States usually begins in October of 1870, close to the township of Osage in Lebec County, Kansas, named for the Osage Trail, which was located not far from the Benders' claimed plot. The trail was carved out many years earlier by indigenous people of the Osage tribes, but was only now officially named that by the still relatively new US government. Where the Benders came from and where they traveled through to end up in Kansas, it's a mystery whose answer has likely been lost to time. Where exactly the Benders came from, nobody really knows. The most likely option seems to be John Sr. and co. originated from Germany, the Netherlands, or Norway. thanks largely to their accents and some reports of the family speaking German. Bender was definitely not the family's true name, and when/why exactly they adopted it, it's a whole thing in itself, but we'll get to that in a bit. The family was led by patriarch John Bender Sr. John Sr. was thought to be around 60 years old when the family first settled in Kansas. He spoke in a deep voice in broken English with a heavily Germanic accent. Pretty much every account of John Sr. has him pinned as a nasty, thuggish brute of a man. Contemporary accounts aren't much more favourable to his wife, who goes by either Kate, Elvira, or Almira, depending on what account you're reading. Like, so many details, Mrs. Bender's name, it completely varies depending on what story you heard. According to most, she was a little younger than John Sr., being in her mid-50s around the time the Bender family popped up in Kansas to claim their 160 acres. Reports were far from kind, with contemporary accounts referring to her as everything from a hag to a she-devil. The Bender children were thought of, well, basically a little better in John Jr.'s case, and a lot better in Kate's case. That was the two children, John Jr. and Kate. Though John Jr. was a much more handsome and amiable man than his father, he wasn't held in particularly high regard thanks to his habit of breaking out in nervous laughter. Creepy, a Joker-like he kind of sounds like, to be honest. So due to this unfortunate issue, the Benders' neighbours, rather unkindly, thought of him as being a bit of a dim bulb, or a half-wit is their words to be exact. John Jr. did speak fluent English, unlike his parents, and with only a slight accent. He could be charming when he wanted to be, but was still not exactly popular with the other settled families in the area. The last Bender, Kate, was by far the most highly regarded of the Bender clan, and spoke the best English with no detectable accent at all. In her early to mid-20s, Kate was known locally from flyers she posted around the township and nearby Cherryvale that advertised her services as a psychic medium, able to fix her customers' psychic issues, and even contact the dead on their behalf, if you can believe that, folks. Woo! Kate also garnered herself a level of notoriety after she led several seances and delivered lectures around town. The lectures were ostensibly on spiritualism and the spiritualist movement, which was very popular at this time as we move into the late 1800s. The pseudo-religious lectures became something of a vehicle for Kate's personal brand of politics. See, Kate's views were considered extreme and bizarre, as they often went against the more traditional conservative views of the day. For instance, one of Kate's core beliefs was in free love, that it was morally fine for anybody to love anybody else. And so, I hear you, maybe you're thinking, alright, you go girl, slay queen. Maybe you're thinking that, but, steady on, slow your roll if you're thinking that, because when Kate said it's fine to love anyone, she meant literally anyone. That included, brother and sister. She was all for that. Quote, "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their proper sway, even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister? I say it should not be smothered." That's something she said, and yikes. Okay. Which brings me to the confusion over the exact relationship between Kate and John Jr. and basically the entire family. Like, exactly how the four were related or whether they were even biologically related at all, that's actually unknown. There was and has never been any legal documentation to confirm their relationships to one another. That's largely thanks to the names they'd become famous under, likely not being their actual birth names. Kate was either John Jr.'s sister, his wife, or, worryingly both, depending on which account you believe. Oddly enough, though, despite Ma and Pa Bender keeping to themselves, the younger Benders, John Jr. and Kate, were well known about town and even attended Sunday school, where I'm sure Kate had a ruddy good time. The family ran a sort of grocery store out of their single-room cabin home and would often offer travelers a place to stay for a small price. Both John Sr. and Jr. had initially made the move to Kansas ahead of Kate, Elvira, or Almira, and also the younger Kate, in order to build up the cabin, sleeping in a tent as they did so. Once the cabin was built, John Jr. sent word to the women to meet them in Ontario. Once there, the reunited family stocked up on provisions, enough for themselves and to stock their store, before hauling the lot back to their new home in Kansas. From there, the family divided the dwelling, their cabin, in two. They'd use these like cloth sheets, basically, with the rear acting as living quarters and the front becoming their improvised dry goods store. See, a safe and comparatively comfortable place to sleep while trekking across the frontier was an offer far too good to refuse for most people. So that, and being right next to the well-trodden trail like the Osage, well, basically the Bender family, their cabin and store, it would have plenty of footfall. That was guaranteed, and the majority of those feet that were fallen, it was further guaranteed to be mostly single men going on ahead of their families or traveling alone to seek their own new beginning. So naturally, the promise of a fresh start and a chunk of land, as long as you were brave enough to gamble your own safety against its ownership, it didn't exactly appeal, to the already wealthy and stable, so you can imagine a type of guys who would be making the journey to the frontier at this time. I mean, okay, there was certainly no shortage of rich sending out their own agents to claim and farm the land on their behalf, but the ones who were going out there were more often like the Benders themselves, basically those with nothing or very little to lose. As has always been the case, basically throughout civilization in the eyes of predators looking to feast, the poor, the disenfranchised, and the perilous, they're ripe for the picking. So, to the Bender family, the frontier promised them a steady stream of people with no one to question their whereabouts should they not be ever heard from again. Now, the family would often trade goods in town. Clothing, jewelry, even horses and saddles, which were, very desirable items at the time. These often personal items were sold under the guise of having been traded to the Benders for food and for bedding their family in lieu of payment by travelers lacking the, necessary cash to actually pay the Benders. They would simply trade shit. Of course, this was, well, folks, you know where this is going. This was a great cover for the real source of the valuables. The Bender family antics went undetected for quite some time. Yeah, people went missing after staying at their inn, but people were always going missing everywhere at this time. Besides, they were nobodies who went missing. They had nobody to look for them. See, in the winter of 1871, a couple of bodies had turned up with obvious signs of foul play, but again, it was sort of just, maybe it was the natives acting up again. At least, that was true until the winter of 1872. When Mr. George Newton Longcore, along with his 18-month-old daughter, Marianne, stopped by the Bender home on their way to start a new life with his parents in Lee County, Iowa, following the deaths of his 21-year-old wife and his infant son. So to everybody, George Newton Longcore and his daughter, they left Independence, Kansas, and were simply never seen again. They left the area, nobody ever seen him again. But Longcore's disappearance was enough to cause his former neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, to set out himself in search of what happened to his friend. See, Longcore had bought the horses he and his daughter used on their trip from Dr. York. So Dr. William York, he was like, this is weird, I'm not hearing from them. What happened? The amateur detective followed in the Longcore's footsteps along the Osage Trail and got as far as Fort Scott in Bourbon County, Kansas, where his brother, Ed, lived. All along his journey, Dr. York questioned each resident and homesteader he met as to whether or not they'd seen his friend, Longcore. Some had, some hadn't, but ultimately, Dr. York was unable to find what had become of them and basically was like, I give up. He decided it was time to return home. He set off on the return journey, but he never made it himself. Unlike most at the time, and certainly those that the Benders were used to dealing with though, Dr. York was not a man without education and resources. He was a man with connections, and most importantly, his brothers. As well as Ed, the brother who lived in Fort Scott, William had another brother, Alexander, better known as Colonel Alexander M. York. Alexander York was a lawyer and veteran of the Civil War who'd become a politician and just so happened to be a senator for Kansas. After William left Ed in Fort Scott but failed to arrive at Independence where Alexander was expecting him, the two immediately began looking for their brother. Colonel York, being a man of significant standing, gathered 50 men and followed his brother's trail. Along the way he met up with Ed, and together they questioned not only every resident and homesteader, but every traveler too, everybody asking what happened to their brother. Late in the month, March 28th, Colonel York and his companion, Mr. Johnson, visited the Benders' home. That was their next stop along the trail. Colonel York explained the situation to the Benders, who readily confirmed to him that his brother had indeed visited and had even stayed the night, although they insisted he was happy and healthy when he left. They did suggest that perhaps maybe, hey, you know what, maybe he's run into one of them hostile local tribes. Colonel York agreed that was certainly a leading theory at the time, and he and his pal even stayed over for dinner with the family, before seemingly departing on good terms. Any goodwill quickly evaporated, however, when members of Colonel York's entourage informed him of rumours doing the rounds about the old hag Elvira herself, Mrs. Bender. Allegedly, a woman had been seen fleeing the Bender home screaming and visibly crying. The source of her terror had come in the shape of Elvira and a rather large kitchen knife. Elvira, Mrs. Bender, had apparently threatened to kill the woman, which was in strong contrast to the polite welcome that the Colonel had received himself. Drawing the conclusion that the family may just be hiding something very sinister, Colonel York gathered a small armed posse, and on April 3rd, 5 days after he had previously been there, Colonel York returned to the Benders' home and confronted Elvira about the allegations. So, in response to these absurd, ludicrous accusations, Elvira acted very much like someone who would definitely not in a million years, never threaten a young lady with a knife. I mean, she acted this way by explosively losing her temper and screaming in a foreign language at Colonel and his compadres. John Jr. and Kate, they backed up their quote-unquote mother, if she was their mother, they backed up Elvira, repeating that the incident never happened. She would never threaten somebody with a knife. You must be joking. Colonel York, however, was not satisfied with that and accused Elvira once again. In several accounts, Elvira also let slip that, in fact, she did understand English far better than she'd been letting on, as she told, in English, that her accuser, the young lady who'd fled in terror, she was in fact a witch who'd cursed Elvira's coffee. With only hearsay to go on, and without any, physical evidence to back it up, Colonel York left the Benders. But before he was accosted by Kate, who offered her services as a clairvoyant to help find his missing brother. She didn't miss a trick, he was trying to make some money out of this. Colonel York was far more calm and proper about the situation than the rest of the men with him, but the consensus was between them all that the Benders were guilty as all hell, and should be hanged from the highest tree they could find. The men wanted to string up the Benders' neighbours also, the Roaches, as accomplices alongside them, but fortunately for them, Colonel York's good sense prevailed when he insisted they go by law. And he was going to stick around close by, by Osage, this area. He's going to stay around here for a while, investigate further who really were the Benders and where they involved with his brother's disappearance. Once the Benders were squarely in the Colonel's crosshairs, rumours spread quickly, and rumblings of a county-wide conspiracy were being shared between curtain-twitching housewives and drunk cowboys alike. The Colonel wasn't letting the bitching distract him from his singular goal, though. He wanted his brother, dead or alive. Amongst growing concerns and calls to lynch the Bender family, their friends, and anyone who got in the mob's way, the township authorities knew they needed to do something to avoid all-out chaos. So it was decided that a town hall meeting was needed. Not having a town hall, the community was invited to the Harmony Grove schoolhouse, so everyone's issues could be aired. How about we just have a big old sit down and talk this out? Around 75 members of the Osage community were reported to have assembled, which, given the distances between homes and ranges, needed to, it was a mighty big number, basically. Kansas is big and flat. Obviously, the center of most of the attention, it went to Colonel York, who was like the big dog around town. Some reports have John and John Jr. attending to speak in their defense, but others say the family was absent, so honestly, folks, I'm not 100% sure if they were there, to be honest. But either way, the meeting didn't do too much to quell the growing community outrage. The crowd discussed the recent disappearances, especially that of William York. And of course, the other disappearance William York was investigating when he disappeared. What happened to Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter? In the end, it was decided that, guilty or not, the Benders seemed to be at the epicenter of whatever was happening, and they needed to be proven innocent or otherwise before things got out of hand. It was agreed that the best resolution was to issue warrants. Let's have a look around their place ourselves, see if we find anything suspicious. And not just of, the Benders' home, but every homestead in the area of the disappearances. One way or another, the authorities wanted to get to the bottom of the mystery. Strange folk going missing, couple of bodies turning up, that, initially, Injuns, at it again. But no, this didn't seem like natives. This seemed like something horrifying was happening in the area. Unfortunately, during the few weeks between the Colonel's visit, the town hall meeting, and the few days during which DL's square wheels of justice struggled to get the warrants needed, it seems that basically during all of this time, no one thought they should maybe possibly be keeping an eye on their primary suspects. 3 days after the meeting at the schoolhouse, a cowboy identified as Billy Toll, well, he was doing what cowboys do, and as the herd was passing by the Benders' homestead, this Billy, he noticed, the place seemed suspiciously quiet, and apparently empty. For obvious reasons, it wasn't exactly a normal thing to leave any home completely unattended in those days, so seeing that no one was around at all, well, that rang a few alarm bells in old Billy Boy's head. Billy Toll reported what he'd seen to the deputy sheriff as soon as he returned to town. But thanks to severe storms, it was over a week before a posse could be formed to get over there and investigate the Benders' home. When conditions cleared up though, almost the whole county turned out in answer to calls for volunteers to help in the potential search. Colonel York himself led most of the semi-organized mob to the party. On their arrival at the abandoned inn, they found the place had been completely emptied. It looked like someone had looted every possible item in the home. Food, clothes, the lot. Something of interest was found, though, in a Roman Catholic prayer book left behind. Inside the book were notes, handwritten in German, and the notes read things like Johanna Bender, born July 30, 1848. John Gerbhardt came to America July 1st. Big Slaughter Day, January 8th. And Hell Departed. The names, though, led nowhere, and what this meant, well, pretty uncertain, but it sounds kind of creepy, not gonna lie. The preliminary search of the cabin also turned up 3 different hammers, a claw hammer, a shoe hammer, and finally, a sledgehammer. Colonel York himself was reported to have found a 4-inch knife, complete with rust-coloured stains hidden in a clock on the Benders' mantelpiece. With the home almost completely empty, there was nothing to distract investigators from a very suspicious odor emanating from somewhere in the cabin. Following their noses, the Colonel and his pals were led to a trap door that had been very deliberately hidden by a bed frame. To make it more obvious that nothing good was going to come of opening the trapdoor, it had also been nailed shut. Once they pried it open, the smell hit them immediately and caused them to pull back. When they finally inspected the concrete slab underneath, the men found a whole lot of brown stains that seemed to be the source of the rank odor. Whether the blood had soaked into the stone from above or was seeping up underneath from something buried, that couldn't be determined without breaking through the slab. The posse called for sledgehammers and proceeded to smash through the foundation slab, but found nothing. But the blood was enough to persuade Colonel York and the Osage authorities that the Bender property needed to be thoroughly torn apart. And that's exactly what they did. The investigation began with the men literally surrounding the cabin and physically lifting the frame up in order to dig deeper directly beneath. The first part of the search ended in frustration though, as nothing more was found underneath the foundations. The frustrations, however, wouldn't be lasting too long, as during a scan of the rest of the Benders' property, it was noticed that there seemed to be several patches of disturbed ground. Some seemed to have been settled a long time ago, while others appeared much more recent. One in particular was worryingly fresh. Groups were sent to probe the ground with a metal rod, and in the area of freshly disturbed ground, located in the vegetable garden, plus others in the orchard, they quickly found resistance. Something was buried in the ground, and before a shovel was even lifted, everybody already knew what was coming. Dr. York's body was found that evening. It had been buried upside down, with his feet closest to the surface. The diggers only had to move a couple of inches of dirt before they uncovered his feet. Throughout the evening, several more graves were found. That potentially made 10 in total. After a couple of hours went by since the 10th was found, around midnight, the search was called off. In the morning, as the suspected graves were dug up, it was decided that they'd likely uncovered all there was to uncover, but they would still check the wider area just in case. Out of the 9 suspected graves, 8 bodies were found, with 2 of the graves turning out to be empty. And if you're wondering about the math, it's because one of the graves in the apple orchard contained the remains of 2 people. That was missing George Loncourt and his daughter Mary, whose disappearances began the Bender family downfall. The further search of the property turned up another victim, though not buried at all. This one was at the bottom of a well and was kept company by several body parts that didn't belong to the same victim. The man in the well was later identified as Johnny Boyle from Howard County, Kansas. Once exhumed, a quick analysis of each set of remains revealed that each had several things in common, including severe impact damage to the skull. Several were in good enough condition that it was clear the victims had their throats cut. One of the bodies, that of Mary Ann Loncourt, the 18-month-old baby, was found to have no visible injuries, which led to speculation that either she had been strangled, or quite possibly, and more cruelly, been buried alive. Bullet holes were found in the cabin, more than a dozen, but none of the victims showed any signs of being shot, so it was speculated that the holes were from victims who had attempted to fight after being attacked. Other victims identified in the apple orchard were John Greery, Red Smith, Abigail Roberts. The various body parts were not able to be linked to any of the victims in the apple orchard, and indicated that there were likely far more victims than the official toll. The various parts were never claimed, and were said to have been from as many as another 20 people. In fact, the majority of the remains, even some of those ID'd, were not claimed, and were reburied in an area at the base of a small hill, around a mile south of the Benders orchard. The area is still known today as the Benders Mounds. 4 unidentified men's bodies were also found in the Drum Creek area, and appeared to have died in a similar manner to those found on the Bender property, heads bashed in, throats cut. These men were likely earlier victims of the Benders, before they seemingly got bored with dragging their bodies out to a disposal site a couple of miles away, and so after those 4 men were killed, they just started burying everybody else to feed the apples they had growing outside their home. Yummy! Unsurprisingly, once the story hit the newspapers, it quickly caught the public's attention, and soon every Tom, Dick, and Harry began to turn up to see the grim sight of the bloody Benders cabin. Newspaper reports indicate that more than 3,000 people visited the cabin, coming from as far as New York and Chicago. People were fascinated by what happened, and since the murderous attraction didn't exactly have a souvenir shop, basically visitors would help themselves, with many taking pieces of the cabin or even of the stone slab that had once formed the foundations. And so tall tales also sprung up, some based on the facts and some, maybe not so much, folks. The prevailing narrative went by that the Benders would use Kate's charms to woo guests into staying the night at the inn. Once they settled in, the guest would be invited to supper and seated at the head of the table, right over the trap door. When the chance came and the victim's guard was down, one of the Benders, from behind the tarp that divided the room, would strike the victim hard on the head, most likely with a hammer. When the victim was subdued, one of the women would cut the victim's throat before the trapdoor was opened and the body was allowed to drop in. Later, to be searched and stripped of any valuables, and then being relocated to, begin a new life as fertilizer for the Benders vegetable patch and orchard. Several former guests of the Benders Inn, they actually backed up this theory that that's exactly what the Benders would do. One man named William Pickering claimed he'd been offered the seat at the head of the table, but had refused it after he'd spotted the stains on the tarp right behind it. His refusal enraged Kate Bender, who came at him with a bread knife. Women running at you with knives runs in the family, leading to William doing a legger out the front door and off to safety. Another account came from a priest, Father Paul Ponsiglione, who claimed to have spotted John Bender trying to conceal a large hammer. I love the idea of just trying to hide it behind his back. What do you got there? Nothing? At which point, once the priest saw it, he excused himself, pretended to see his horse, but instead mounted the horse and got the hell out of Dodge. So obviously the Benders not being in custody, or hanging from the rafters of their own home as was more likely, it absolutely infuriated the county, with mobs being formed that looked to direct their anger at anyone they could get their hands on, guilty or no. A whole host of Osage lads, basically, anybody deemed to be a wrong'un, they were all rounded up and held in custody. One of the unfortunate Osage lads who landed himself in a mob sightline was a guy named Brockman. He was said to have been friendly with the Benders, and with the family nowhere to be seen, Basically, that was good enough to merit a hanging for many. Brockman ended up being hanged, not once, not twice, but 3 times before being cut down and interrogated during the intervals. Depending on the source, though, the crowd either got bored and sent him on his way after choking him a 3rd time, or more likely it's probably just the government got in the way and were like, stop that, please, that'll do. So, the big question was, what happened to the bloody Benders themselves? Investigators were actually able to track the family quite a lot further than you would think, following their trail all the way to the border of Texas and New Mexico after they had fled a couple of days after the town meeting. Trackers were able to pick up the Benders' wagon trail, leaving their farm and ending around 12 miles north, just outside the tiny city of Thayer in Neosho County, Kansas. That was where the trackers found the Benders' wagon and team of starving horses. One of the horses had pulled up lame, which could have been the reason why the Benders chose to abandon them where they did. It was later revealed the family had purchased tickets to travel by railroad to Humboldt City in Allen County, Kansas, which is around 300 miles away. The 2 younger Benders, John Jr. and Kate, allegedly deboarded the train in Chanute, Neosho County, where they switched to another train, which they rode all the way to the end of the line just outside Denison, Texas. It seemed like the mother and father went separate ways from their children. I guess they figured it was safer to split up. The younger, John Jr. and Kate, they headed to a known outlaw colony somewhere in the border region of New Mexico. But that was where the trail ended, with marshals being unwilling to enter the area as they knew of previous occasions when lawmen went in here and were never seen again. The elder Benders, though, continued on the train after the younger 2 departed and eventually arrived in Kansas City. From there, they bought tickets on another train to St. Louis, Missouri. And from there, what became of the Benders is largely best guess, speculation, folklore, and outright fantasy. Huge amounts of attention was being focused on the story, and a massive reward of $2,000, which is more than $50,000 in today's, was offered by the then Kansas governor. Who knows, though, what really happened to them. But, listen folks, we got theories. We got theories galore. So settle in. A couple of the earliest popped up towards the end of 1884. That was 12 years after the Benders were last seen. The first theory involved a man named John Flickinger, who had reportedly committed suicide in the Lake Michigan area. The reason that this caught the attention of those following the Bloody Benders story was because the name John Flickinger had previously been linked to the Benders as a possible real identity behind John Sr. Bender. Many at the time seemed to believe that this was indeed John Sr. The remains of Flickinger matched with the known descriptions of John Sr., and while it's not, nailed on, it seems one of the likely endings of Pa Bender. Another less likely possibility, though far more interesting, involves an unidentified male who seems to match the description of Pa Bender Sr. The elderly man, 60 plus, was arrested in Montana and held in the sheriff's cage for murdering a man with a hammer to the noggin. Classic Bender, am I right? The arrest was in Montana, but the murder happened in Idaho. The sheriff, though, thinking this guy looks pretty interesting, he sent a word to Kansas, requesting someone come and ID the man in the cage, and someone was sent. Even the sheriff himself thought you could possibly be John Bender Sr. Unfortunately, though, there wasn't exactly an express flight between Kansas and Montana at the time, and so by the time the man sent to ID the prisoner arrived, the prisoner was not only deceased, but in a severe state of decomposition, which made a positive ID impossible. Why was the prisoner no longer sucking air? Well, the prisoner only went and did a bloody jigsaw on himself, if you can believe that. He decided that he really didn't want to go to prison, or maybe he was afraid of being identified as John Sr., and so he cut his own leg off to escape his leg irons, and subsequently bled to death. Though why on earth he cut his leg off and not the irons, that's a whole other question. Only he can answer that one, and, well, he ain't sucking air anymore, but either way, he was dead and gone. Ma and Kate Bender are by far the most likely to have faced actual legal justice. In October 1889, newspapers reported that a Miss Almira Monroe and a Mrs. Sarah Eliza Davis were arrested weeks earlier in Michigan after being accused of theft. They were eventually found not guilty and set to be let go, only to be immediately rearrested on suspicion of being Elvira and Kate Bender. Contemporary reports indicate that the pair had been identified by a Mrs. Frances E. McCann, the daughter of one of the Benders' victims. She had tracked the pair from Osage, Kansas. So, sounds fairly legit, right? You know, daughter of one of their victims had been on their trail for years and had finally found them. But, it gets a little shaky when it was revealed that McCann claimed to have been led to the pair by prophetic dreams she'd had. This time, the prisoners weren't able to do a jigsaw and escape to the Netherrealm before further witnesses could come down from Osage, and they positively identified the women as Ma and Kate Bender too. So it wasn't just the dream bollocks from McCann's original accusation, few other folk did identify them, including the deputy sheriff who had travelled all the way from Kansas. During questioning, the woman known as Mrs. Sarah Eliza Davis openly admitted that the woman she was travelling with was, in fact, Ma Bender, but said she wasn't Kate Bender. I'm not Kate Bender. Yes, that is Elvira Bender, but I'm not Kate Bender. No. I'm Sarah Bender. Kate's previously never mentioned long-lost twin sister. She literally pulled up, my twin was one of the killers, not me. I mean, the thing is though, she may as well have been telling the truth. The lawmen weren't having any of it though, and the pair were extradited to Kansas, where they would eventually stand trial. But before they could be, a 13-person panel was established to formally identify the women before their trial. And it quickly fell apart. They couldn't be proven that they were in fact Ma and daughter Bender at all, and so they were let go. John Jr.'s fate is the far most unknown of the killer foursome. One detective claimed that John Jr. died of apoplexy. That's a sudden stroke caused by a blood clot shaking loose. While that's entirely possible, there's no paper trail or independent witnesses to back up that claim though. That's the thing, a big measure of each of the claims' validity is that, despite 50 years worth of people coming forward to spin their own tale of encountering the family, not one of those people who claim to know what happened to the Benders ever went after the money that was offered. And it was a lot of money for back in the day. That money was never claimed. So there must have been something in the Kansas water, because the Benders weren't the only Kansas-based murderous family operating in the Old West. Just 10 years after the Benders' killings were discovered and the family evaporated into the fog of folklore, the Kelly family would themselves be credited with murdering travelers who were passing through Oak City, Kansas. If the low estimates of the Benders' toll is accurate, the families scored a tie, with 11 victims apiece. Of course, these similarities between the two, the Bender family and the Kelly family, led to rumors of the families being one and the same. They just changed their names, but it's unlikely there was any connection whatsoever. The modus operandi were different, and even the number of family members, it didn't add up, unless they too had a long-lost twin sister they never mentioned before. All that remains of the Benders' cabin home today is a historical marker located at the rest area of the junction between Route 400 and US Route 169. And that, my friends, is the legendary tale of the murderous, bloody Benders. Thank you, folks, so much for giving us all tale of goo. Thanks so much for listening. It means a lot to moi. Appreciate you guys, as always. Next solo episode of the TCP, That Chapter podcast, will be up. Well, it's every Monday. I suppose you know at this point, so keep an eye out. And you know what? You know the drill, folks. New episodes of the That Chapter regular videos are up every week on the main channel, so give it a go. Please do. But until then, take care of each other and yourselves. If Keith was here, he would say, see ya. But I'll just say, I love ya. Bye.